there are plenty of folk in business who will say that we shouldn't get involved in politics. And that's fine, but you absolutely should get involved in public policy. It's really important for companies to spend some time thinking about how what they're doing is going to shape the world that they're living in and the extent to which they can take control over their own destiny.
Hi, I'm Belden Menkus, founder of Menkus & Associates, the strategy firm for businesses with a broader purpose. Welcome to The Purposeful Strategist, a podcast about how business leaders are bringing their organization's purpose and strategy to life. My guest today is Nigel Lake, co-founder and executive chair of Pottinger, the independent global advisory firm he co-founded in 2003. Pottinger works with leading companies, governments, and industry bodies on strategy, mergers and acquisitions, capital raising, and public policy. His work centers on helping senior leaders make investments that stand the test of time across borders, cultures, and industries. He began his career at KPMG, moved into investment banking at Barings, and then HSBC, before stepping off that path to build something different. Nigel, welcome to The Purposeful Strategist.
It's great to be here.
Really great to have you. So you spent over a decade in investment banking. What made you leave to then go on and co-found Pottinger in 2003?
It's a great question. And I think what it was, and I'm trying to give an honest answer here rather than the revisionist history that you might then impose on it. I had spent a decade or so in investment banking, mostly in London, some time in Japan. I had seen how decisions were being made in large companies and by big investors and could see all sorts of ways in which that wasn't working. And also from my own point of view, I could see what would life be like if I continued in those very large organizations. And there was great success to be had and a lot of money to be made, but I wanted a different path for myself. And I also thought there must be somehow a better way for me, a better way for businesses to make decisions. And those ideas were rumbling around in my mind. And on the advice of some dear friends from the West Coast of the US, they said, just put white space in your life. If you have the luxury to be able to do this, stop what you're doing, create space for something new to grow, and then see what happens. And that was where I started.
So it sounds like in the beginning, you didn't, unlike many sort of founding stories, you didn't have some picture of this is what I want to build and now I'm going to go out and build that. So if you can, take us through, how did your thinking develop in that white space and how's it evolved to get to what Pottinger is today?
Perhaps like every good client, I actually followed the advice, because we may come back to this later. Sometimes you can get to a great plan and then simply it doesn't get executed. But I did just put, with my co-founder, we put white space in our lives and we thought about a whole variety of different things. And as she would say, all the other things were crazy. My version of it is most of them weren't crazy at all. They were just crazy for us to do because they weren't really things that we would be good at doing. They were businesses that deserve to exist and ought to be successful. And indeed, a series of them were created by other people and became very successful. But I and she weren't the people to do that. And we came back to the world of advice and ultimately a world we knew better, and attempted to build something that was better for us as individuals, that was better for our team. And that team's obviously evolved over the years, and that was, we hoped, would be better for our clients. And I think, looking back through history, and we're 23 years into this adventure, more or less, I think for the most part, that has been true.
And so what does Pottinger do today?
Yeah, so the essence of what we're doing is in some ways providing the typical kind of input that a strategic consultant or an investment banker would provide. But we bring those two skill sets together. So anything to do with strategy has numbers attached and a really rational analysis of, will this actually work over time? And the banking things have something attached to them more than just getting a deal done because a closed deal is a good deal. What that really means, it's helping people build businesses, raise capital to build those businesses, realize value at the right time by selling those businesses or bringing partners in, particularly in areas that, I guess, originally we saw as of long-term importance. So what we would now call the energy transition, the coming food system transition, areas related to education and care, and things which 15 or 20 years ago seemed a bit far in the future and Now, the energy transition is very well underway. A huge amount of capital is being deployed globally. We're very active in that. And areas like food system transition, and I'm in France at the moment and look out of my window and I see a lot of birds and a lot of insects. And most places you go now, if there's industrial agriculture, you don't see insects and you don't see birds. And so that food system transition is coming, but it's still a bit over the horizon. But if we have a conversation like this in 5 or 10 years' time, then we'll be talking about some of that like we talk about the energy transition today.
So some of what you've talked about there sounds very similar to what I do. We're both, at one level or another strategy consultants, but I also have the sense that you're doing something different, both different from a lot of strategy consultants and different from investment bankers. And you sort of touched on it. You gave it some labels, but if you can you lift the lid and show us a bit of the, what's the magic that makes that happen?
Yeah, it is a really resolute focus on the long term. I think an awful lot of people in business and caught up in there being a lot of noise, a lot of change, new technologies, the latest buzzwords flying around. And this year it's AI, and not so long ago it was crypto and Bitcoin and all of that. And I think people get drawn into the idea that with all this change, you can only think short term. Something that I guess I realized a really long time ago was that predicting what's going to happen over the really quite short term is actually surprisingly difficult in many regards. We know when the sun's going to rise tomorrow and for the rest of time, but do we know what's going to happen to the oil price in 3 months' time? No, because there's a whole lot of wild actors influencing that outcome. Do we know that no one is going to be using fossil fuels for driving cars and trucks around in 10 or 15 years' time? Very few people do, just because the economics driving a particular outcome, and you would need a bigger and bigger subsidy. And there's lots of places where if you understand how technology is evolving, you can understand very clearly where the world will end up. You can argue about how quickly it will get there. You may not like the conclusion, but you can know. And people at Hewlett-Packard knew that the smartphone would emerge in the form that we think of a smartphone today in the early 2000s. They knew that in the early 90s because screen technology was evolving, battery technology was evolving, processing power was evolving, and the energy it required was evolving to the point where you could see you could end up with a small form factor computer with a screen like we know today, way in advance. But big cheeses at Hewlett-Packard didn't want to act on that.
Right.
Okay? Nokia had a phone that looked like an iPhone several years before the iPhone was launched. One of my colleagues used to work for Nokia, held it in his hand. But the folk at Nokia knew that people liked candy bar phones.
Yeah.
They couldn't see beyond that. It's like the candy bar phone could never win once you got something that was a small computer.
So what's the purpose that kind of ultimately drives your work? Because I could hear it as helping business people make better decisions. Nothing wrong with that. But I could also hear some other things maybe in it. But so I'm not imagining it. Can you unpack that a bit?
Yeah, the essence in some ways absolutely is. I mean, for me, when people make poor decisions or they say things which you just know, which you can know are wrong because there's some simple, robust analysis you can do to show that, that really does make me frustrated. But it makes me especially frustrated in anything which matters for more than just the people in the room. So the energy transition, you can look at it through the lens simply of industrial efficiency, cost efficiency, but you can also look at it through the lens of, well, who benefits from all of this technology? How can it be delivered in a way which is good for the people making the investment, but also good for everybody else? And I think part of my focus on all of that comes from this, and I don't know where I got this focus on the long term from. It just something that grew up inside me. But if you think about the long term, if you do everything just for the benefit of a small number of people and make them very rich, then revolutions happen. And this has happened in France and Russia and Spain, and America's going through its version of it now, and plenty of other places. And those revolutions end badly for almost everybody. And to me, it just seems logical. You should be trying to figure out how to do these things in a way which makes life better for more people, because that will make it for a better business, a less risky investment. It's one of these everyone wins things, which to me seems blindingly obvious, but clearly isn't blindingly obvious because there are plenty of people who don't think this way.
And it does seem to be in a number of things you've talked about. Clearly, technology and understanding where it's going plays a big part. It also seems sort of, systems thinking, strategic vision, a bigger sense. Where does that come from? I mean, did you train in some of those things? Have you done academic work around the long term and how you think about it? Or is it more kind of from the gut?
So I started out as a scientist. I studied sciences at Cambridge University. Quite by accident, ended up majoring in history and philosophy of science, which taught me a fair amount about how thinking had developed and the idea of systems of knowledge and proof and words like epistemology, which people in that world would understand and people in business don't really think about because business doesn't really have a system that's robust for knowing what's good and bad. There's the idea that if you focus on making lots of profit, that will work really well, but there's very little empirical evidence actually that it really does. But so long as people are making money, they don't ask those inconvenient questions. So the science was part of it. I also was just interested in the way the world worked in a very practical level from a very young age. I had a brother that was very similarly minded. He ended up being an engineer, and maybe some of that interest in the real world rubbed off on me. And so when I went to work in finance, originally in doing the accounting thing, because I wanted to see how businesses really work from a financial point of view, I became more and more interested in, I guess, not just how businesses work, but how they were run, how decisions were made, and the impact that had. And I've also always been interested in technology. And this, again, maybe it's one of these things where there are accidents of history which color your view, but I was lucky to be at a school where one of the guys at the school, one of the teachers who previously played rugby for Scotland's B team, so it was rumored, it was a very gruff math teacher, was instrumental in getting that school to buy a computer before there were personal computers. But we had a computer when I was, 11 years old. And I was not interested in really how the computer worked, but I was really interested in what it could do. And then when I started work, KPMG had bought computers not for everybody, but about one between three. But they sat on the desks and no one really knew what to do with them. So from a really early stage in my career, I started exploring what is the intersection between technology and business and what people do with their time. And you mentioned the systems thinking thing. Many years later, I met one of the grandfathers of systems thinking who explained what he did. And I thought, system dynamics, that's just how my brain is wired. And people that have brains wired like that, that's just how you think. You think about the whole system and it drives you to all sorts of interesting conclusions, and it drives a different approach and a different way of engaging.
Just to kind of come back to Pottinger for a minute, it's a relatively small organization. I mean, it's not tiny, but it's not in the HSBC, sort of realm. So, you play at a very large scale, though. So first of all, as a business, how do you do that? And then what does that mean for you as a leader?
Yeah, and I think someone along the way said, you don't need to be a big business to have a big impact. You don't have to have a big team to have a big impact. And it partly comes down to the ambition, but it also comes down to capability and ability to engage with people. But to go to the starting point, how do you do that? You've got to think about your business and the infrastructure you build in your business as if you were a large organization with all of the essential strength and resilience and quality that would come with that. So we're a small business, but we could have 100 times as many employees and we would not need to change much at all about anything to do with how we recruit, how we train people, how we appraise people, all of that. And our business is 90-something% people in terms of the costs in it. There's very little you'd change if we were enormously large as we are, because we built it by taking the best of what we'd seen in some very large organizations and also things we'd seen in very large organizations we thought didn't work well, and said, let's just make all that work well. So when someone joins us, they turn up on day one, everything works. The computer works, the phone works, they have their business cards, it all just works. And that's mind-numbingly easy to do. But I suspect most of the people listening to this will have started most of their jobs and discovered on day one there was a surprising number of things that hadn't quite been switched on yet. So it's that kind of mindset. It's because if you don't have that, then you can't ever hope to rub shoulders or walk on onto the bigger pitch. But if you do have everything which looks and feels and operates at an institutional quality, then you can go anywhere.
And that going anywhere, how do you get access to these, what it sounds like really pretty big organizations, governments? You don't have to be a big organization to have a big impact, but you definitely need to get into the room.
So the traditional way people start these kinds of businesses is they've worked on a large business, they have a big address book, they know lots of people. So when they go out and build something new, they already have that access. And I had that access in one part of the world, but as it happens, we started this business on the complete opposite side of the world. And neither I nor my co-founder really had any relationships at all. And this was in Australia at the time. After we set the business up and had a basic platform and felt like we'd done enough work with enough well-known companies to have earned some credibility, 2 or 3 years doing that, we then set about building relationships. And my co-founder has a particular magic in getting inside the room and getting taken seriously. And my skill is more solving complicated problems and then helping people understand that the solution to the complicated problem in a way that's simple. And I think the other thing is you have to know what it's like to win. And from my Barings days, it was one of the best investment banks in Europe at the time. Every time we went in to pitch for something, we knew that if we did a good job and thought hard enough and prepared well enough in advance, we had as good a chance of winning as that piece of work and that client as anybody. And that if we were diligent, we deserved that win. And it wasn't, interestingly, it wasn't because it was a really old organization that had been around a long time. It was because it had a really thoroughly capable and ambitious and quite young team walking around inside this old institution. So that knowing what it's like to win and being ready to win, and then when the win is there for the taking, actually, hitting the winning shot and winning the client and then doing the work and getting the deal closed. That is an essential thing. And you can have great teams that just somehow, like some of the great sports players that got almost to the top and didn't quite make it, you have to have that ability to go and win.
And you talked about your co-founder having sort of a magic ability. Is there a magic ability around that winning, or is it just think it through carefully, hard graft, do the prep?
If I had a really simple answer to that question, then, we would all be sitting on a beach somewhere wondering how we'd fixed all the problems in the world. It's hard to pin down. Clearly, part of it is being good enough to do good work. Clearly, part of it is a level of self-belief, because if you don't believe in yourself, then the client won't believe in you, and it's incredibly hard. Part of it sometimes is just luck, doing whatever it takes to put yourself in the right place at the right time. Part of it is dealing with the fact that you don't win, and how can you learn from that, and then being tough on yourself and objective and kind all at the same time about, okay, are we still going to where we're trying to get to and doing the right things, and can we learn something from this, or maybe there's nothing to learn from this, we just take that one as a loss, and it goes in the data about wins and losses, and that's where you leave it.
So I'm a little curious then. We've talked about some of the decisions that you and Pottinger sort of as an organization have made over the years. I assume one of those was we're going to open in Australia, even if our whole network's over here, a number of different things, particularly if you think about the more recent decisions about the firm and its strategy. Who's been involved in that? How does it actually happen? Is it you, or maybe you and your co-founder, if they're still involved, or is it's a much more inclusive, lots of people who are part of the firm get involved?
So it's the overall direction is really set by a small number of people at the center of the business. My co-founder is still involved in the strategic decision-making for the business. I have a CEO who's very actively involved in shaping that and providing input to that strategy. So it's really the three of us at the center. We do plenty with the team over time to hear what they think, to learn from them. And indeed, one of the most important decisions we made very early on, which was to allow us to have, as an organization, to have international ambitions, which seemed a little crazy right early on, came from some visioning exercise with the team. Once we've been going a few years, where their view of the future was that there would be people from the business working in different places around the world. That seemed hard to imagine at the time, but I took the lesson, okay, if they can imagine it, why shouldn't we at least allow that to be a possibility. We've ended up working with companies from all sorts of places around the world. And maybe the lesson from that is good advice is still a relatively rare thing. And if you have useful knowledge and good networks relevant to particular types of problem or industries, that can go a long way in a lot of places.
It seems to me you've worked with businesses which often sort of see themselves as being within a system. We're an actor in the system, but we didn't design the system. And then also with government, trade bodies, public bodies of one sort or another, who it seems to me often do see their role as, if not completely designing the systems, shaping it. Does the dynamic shift when you're working, sort of at one level or the other?
I'm just reflecting on that. In some ways, yes, in that the business world, people make decisions. They know that there are some constraints that they have to live within. And one of the things I've seen is that often very large businesses that have a lot of resources and relationships and influence don't believe that they can change the system. But yet an entrepreneur will come along and think, actually, I can. About maybe a bit more than 10 years ago, we took a conscious decision to spend more time working with founder-led businesses because ultimately our view was they were more likely to be successful in some of the emerging industries. And a lot of the work we have done around the energy transition has been with entrepreneurial businesses that have built pipelines of many gigawatts of solar PV generation, for example. And that could have been done by big companies, but at the end, it wasn't. And then on the government side, almost the reverse is true, which is I think many governments are very wary of interfering too much in the commercial world. And they will often say, governments are not good at picking winners. And I think the distinction is picking an individual company as a winner, that can be really hard. Picking an individual technology as a winner may be hard. But if you wind the clock back, let's say 10 years or so, how hard was it to pick the idea that electric vehicles were going to replace fossil fuel vehicles? If you simply looked at the economics involved for the total cost of ownership of the car, it was blindingly obvious electric vehicles would become the thing. What did China do? China dumped a whole load of helicopter money on 20 companies, and China now has some of the best electric vehicle companies in the world. And when I turned up to where I'm at the moment, they handed me a shiny new BYD hybrid, and it's a fantastic car and astoundingly cheap. Even at European prices, it's cheap. So, and that's the thing for governments, I think, is hard, which is how can you step back from, how can you actually intervene in some of the right places at the right time? Because done right, it can make a huge difference.
So given what you've just said about kind of shifting more to focus on founder-led businesses, the sort of, you didn't use the phrase, but I'll say disruptive innovators. Does that mean you're less focused on governments because it's just too hard to get action to happen? Or is it, no, we're doing both?
No, we still work significantly with large companies, large institutional investors. We still will do work with governments. It's just we decided we should spend more of our time than we were with the emerging companies. And I think there's a couple of things here that are really important. One is most people of our rough vintage grew up with the idea of a knowledge economy, and that drove people down this path of specialization in sectors and so forth. And detailed specialist knowledge is still really important, but it's quite accessible now. And many of the interesting things that have happened, and particularly when you end up with an entire change in a system like the energy transition, electrification of transport, many of the interesting things are happening at the intersection between different sectors. A new technology comes along, it allows you to rethink completely how you operate. You don't just automate it in some way, you make it different. Entrepreneurial companies can be really good at that. Sometimes because they don't understand what they're getting involved with, and they then realize 10 years later that it wasn't quite as easy as they thought.
Yeah.
But still, there can be momentum which comes from that. There can be just an energy and a determination to drive change, which allows things to happen, which a large conservative organization might just think was too hard, or might just think doesn't matter that much because the new guys can have 10% of the market and we don't really care. And in some areas, that's fine. And in other areas, if you're a vehicle manufacturer and you haven't got a good electric car, then life's going to look pretty terrible if it doesn't already.
Yeah. Well, and as we know, sometimes that 10% that the incumbents are willing to cede then becomes 20, and then it keeps, and then it's, okay, the game's over.
Yeah, the steep part of the S-curve arrives, and if you haven't started work, then you're 10 years too late.
We've talked a bit about technology. We've sort of somewhat skirted around AI. And just curious, I mean, it felt to me when you were talking about you don't just automate it, you change the way you do things, that's a general rule. But certainly one that I think a lot of people are grappling with about AI. Is that one of those 10 years from now, people are going to look back and go, well, it was just so obvious. In fact, 7 years from now, 5 years from now, they're going to look back and say it was so obvious. Or are you still maybe wondering, is this a bit of hype? Where's this really all going?
Yeah. So AI has been applied as a moniker to all sorts of things. And machine learning as a tool has been around for a very long time and has been able to be applied in all sorts of specific use cases to do quite amazing things. And many businesses have not been remotely ready to deploy that kind of approach, and some have been cautious. And it's absolutely clear that these large language model type systems are very good at some things. They're very good at what they've been designed for, which is producing coherent, persuasive text. But it's very hard to know whether they are giving you something that's actually relevant or true. I asked one of these systems a question about myself this morning, and it just totally fabricated the answer. Nothing remotely right about the answer it gave, which is easy for me to know because I know who I am.
Sure.
But if you ask another question about something that you might find useful, how do you know whether it's true or not? And if the systems aren't trained on truth, which to a significant degree for all of these general applications, they haven't been, because the idea is to be persuasive, not right, then you can understand why they can do cool looking things. But if you're a business looking for a use case, you need something much more nailed down than that. The way I look at this is, computers arrived on people's desks in businesses some point in the 1980s, and it took a really long time for good, effective use cases to be established. But they were. But somehow the world didn't change that much, and somehow the advent of that relatively basic technology allowed more jobs to emerge. So all the people that were doing manual accounting tasks have gone, and they've been replaced by not very much, but they're now, web administrators. The thing that I am concerned about with this next generation of change is that, and it's not really the things under the AI level so much as the very many tasks that can now be automated by machines, that will consume an awful lot of jobs. And those jobs will not magically be replaced by other jobs in a hurry. That's not what's happened over the last several hundred years through several major revolutions of a similar nature, and it won't happen this time. And it's really important for businesses to think about, what is their role in trying to shape the economy that they're participating in. Because if they sit back and think, well, look, we'll just get rid of all the people, replace it with machines, spend more money on American software, but there are still going to be customers to buy our product, who are those customers going to be? And if you're an economy where most of the spending is in a relatively small number of hands, maybe that sort of is okay, and you just let 90% of the population find a way to subsist somehow, which is the American path. But that's a pretty dark place, and you've got to have a plan for how that doesn't turn into some quite nasty revolutionary change. These words I'm using may sound like quite big and extreme things, but if you look back over the history of time and what has happened when economies and countries became very polarized in terms of opportunity, there's plenty of unhappy stories in that. There aren't many where that was that wasn't the genesis of wonderful economic development. It was the genesis of something much worse.
Yeah. One of the things I think I hear in what you're saying, I'm adding some stuff into what you've laid out, but I think it's in there, is the importance of discussion and reasoned debate about a whole bunch of these issues. And it does seem to me that in many countries and many parts of the world, that's not happening. It's not happening because you've got a fairly autocratic system that just debate isn't allowed, or where the mechanisms by which we used to have those debates have sort of become ineffective.
Yeah.
And I realize that's sort of, in some ways that's well outside the remit of this podcast generally, but I do hear it in what you're saying. And for me, it raises a question of what's the role of leaders, and particularly business leaders, in creating the conditions for those debates and discussions to happen.
I think it's really important. There are plenty of folk in business who will say that we shouldn't get involved in politics. And that's fine, but you absolutely should get involved in public policy. And I think it's really important for companies to spend some time thinking about how what they're doing is going to shape the world that they're living in, and the extent to which they can take control over their own destiny. We've seen this now with software, where ultimately much of the software on which many Western companies rely at a foundational level comes from the US. And the US is now operating in an environment where the rule of law is being applied in a different way to what was in the past, and where there is much greater risk involved now in relying on those systems from another nation. So some of these things, they're slippery and they're difficult, and they do require you to be able to sit back and think about an entire system, and to accept that we all play a part in that system in some way. If you're a small company, maybe you only play a small part in it. If you're a big company, you have much more influence. We're all participating in driving that.
Yeah. Yeah. You wrote a book a while ago, not that long ago, but a while ago, called The Long Term Starts Tomorrow. And, it sort of makes, the title kind of tells you where it's going. It makes a case for long-term thinking in a world that often focuses much more on the short term. Do you think that focus on the short term's gotten more or less intense since you wrote the book?
I think it's pretty similar in many ways, in that many organizations and many people are focused on and motivated by short-term considerations because of how their job works, how they're remunerated, a quarterly or half-yearly result cycle, and a response to that which says the only solution is to focus on short-term things in a short-term world. I think what I've seen over it's more than 10 years since we released that book, I've just seen more and more evidence that approach doesn't work. If the relentless short-termism was really the way to go, then presumably you would see CEOs holding their jobs for longer and longer and longer. You find politicians holding their jobs for longer and longer and longer. And aside from the few dictators around the world and a few people that have established really strong, effective control over the governance of an organization, tenure is pretty short. People come and go. Something goes well, everyone hails them as a hero. Something goes badly, they get booted out. Not too many questions are asked why. So I think the other thing that I have seen, which I now, particularly if I'm talking to anybody from places like China or Japan, where long-term thinking is the starting point, I also say, look, if you read this book, then just take it as an illustration of why Western decision-making doesn't work very well. Because you'll see everything in this book is blindingly obvious, and why doesn't everyone do it? But they don't.
Yeah. Nigel, this has been, for me, a really exciting, interesting, kind of intellectually stimulating tour of both what you're up to and sort of your view of the world. Is there anything else you'd like to share with listeners?
The thing you were alluding to this on, what's the link between long-term thinking and what you do now? Clearly, one of the things that I guess I've realized and we've seen is more and more important is you have to have short-term actions you're going to take. You really need those to be in the short-term interests of the people that you need to take them, but they need to align with the right long-term destination that you're trying to reach. Nobody needs to know what the long-term destination is necessarily, because the thing that's going to get people to act is the short-term things that they want to do. If that makes sense. So I'd leave that as a parting thought, which is you have to tantalize people with things with the drink they can pick up right now, not the wine that's going to come off the vine in 10 years' time.
Yeah. Now, figuring, making that link, working backwards from where you're trying to get to what does that mean? What do we have to do in the next 6 weeks? For me, is always one of the more interesting and kind of rewarding bits of any strategy work.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyway, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. I will look forward to perhaps continuing this conversation in a few years and see where you and Pottinger have gotten to. And thank you for joining us.
Fantastic. My great pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. Before you go, just a quick word about the work we do at Menkus & Associates. The standard strategy toolkit is inadequate for businesses with a broader purpose. I work with boards and exec teams to help them get clear on their situation, aligned about who they are, and committed to what they're going to do about it. The result? Better performance overall. Thanks again, and join us soon for the next episode of The Purposeful Strategist.